They gave us 6 hours. At 9 o'clock in the morning, the van from the Harlan County Historical Preservation Society pulled up to the gate of Voss Mansion, and Nora Galt got out with a clipboard, a camera, and a printed inventory checklist that someone had prepared from the county's architectural records. At 3 o'clock that afternoon, the Flood Control Authority would close the upstream valve, and water would begin rising in the valley below. By evening, Voss Mansion would be underwater. By the following week, it would be 30 feet underwater. By the time the reservoir reached its operational level, it would be 60 feet underwater, and it would stay there for as long as the dam held, which the engineers estimated at 100 years. Nora had done this kind of work for 34 years. She was a retired county records archivist, which meant she had spent her career in the discipline of accurate documentation, finding what was there, recording it correctly, resisting the impulse to interpret before you had finished observing. She had been called in for this job because she was thorough, and because she was available, and because the Historical Preservation Society needed someone who could move through a large structure quickly without missing things. She had not been told what to expect. She had been given the checklist and the 6 hours and the architectural drawings from 1921 and the inventory documentation that Calvin Voss had submitted when he signed the voluntary transfer agreement in 2016. The house had been empty since Calvin died in 2019, 4 years without heat, without electricity, without anyone walking the floors. But it had not deteriorated the way abandoned houses deteriorate when they are built poorly. Voss Mansion had been built in 1921 by someone who intended it to last. The brick exterior was intact. The interior plaster was cracked in places but holding. The floors were warped in the rooms where the windows had failed, but solid everywhere else. The structure was sound. It was not falling down. It was being drowned. Someone had decided the dam was worth more than the house, and Calvin Voss had agreed with them or had decided not to argue, which in the end produced the same result. He had signed the voluntary transfer without legal challenge and without explanation, and 3 years later he had died, and the house had sat in the valley waiting for this morning. Nora stepped inside at 9:04 and began moving through the rooms with her clipboard. The main floor took 2 hours. The second floor took 90 minutes. She was methodical, and she did not linger, and she documented everything the checklist required, and several things it did not, because that was how she had always worked. The checklist was the minimum, not the limit. At 12:40, she went to the basement. She had the 1921 architectural drawings with her folded to the basement level plan. The basement was drawn in 2 sections, the main level, which ran the full footprint of the house, and below it a sub-basement designated on the drawing as Storage Room B, a separate room accessed by a door at the far end of the main basement with its own set of stairs, dropping another half-level below the primary floor. She found the door at 12:51. It was original construction oak, heavy set in a stone frame at the far end of the main basement. The hinges were iron, the kind made to last a century, and which had. The door itself was in the same condition as the rest of the structure, old solid, not deteriorated. The lock was different. The lock was a modern padlock, the kind sold at any hardware store in the last 20 years, looped through a steel hasp that had been bolted to the door and the frame with hardware that was new compared to everything around it. Someone had added this lock to a door that had stood for 100 years without one. She checked the inventory documentation Calvin had submitted. Storage Room B was not listed, not omitted by error, not listed as empty or inaccessible, simply not present. The room existed on the 1921 architectural drawings and did not exist in Calvin Voss's 2016 inventory of the property he was voluntarily handing over to the state. Nora looked at the padlock. She looked at the time on her watch. 12:53, 2 hours and 7 minutes before the valve closed. She went back upstairs and found the site supervisor from the Flood Authority and asked him if he had bolt cutters in the truck. He did. Nora had worked in county records for 34 years, and she had developed over those decades a specific sensitivity to absence. Not the absence of things that had never been there, the absence of things that should be there and were not. The gap in a file where a document had been removed, the break in a chain of title where a transfer had been recorded without the underlying instrument, the inventory that listed every room in a house except one. She recognized it the way a doctor recognizes a symptom, not with alarm, with attention. She arrived at Voss Mansion at 9:04 in the morning with Stuart Halley from the Historical Preservation Society, who had arranged the access permit, and who would spend the 6 hours in the van outside with the radio and the paperwork and the phone number for the flood authority in case anything required an extension which both of them knew would not be granted. The valve closed at 3 o'clock. The flood authority had communicated this with the particular finality of an institution that has set a schedule and does not regard individual circumstances as relevant to it. Stuart had said when he handed her the clipboard at the gate, 6 hours is more than enough for a house this size, if you work the way I know you work. She had taken the clipboard and gone inside. The main floor took longer than she had planned, not because she was slow, but because the house was more intact than the inventory suggested. Calvin Voss had removed his personal belongings before he died, clothing photographs the small portable objects of a life, but he had left the things that belonged to the house rather than to him. The chandelier in the front hall was original cast iron, the kind made in the early 1920s when electric light was still new enough that the fixtures were built to impress. The built-in cabinetry in the dining room was walnut fitted to the walls in 1921 and still fitted to them now. The wallpaper in the study was original, a dark green pattern faded and water-stained in one corner but intact across most of the wall, the kind of paper that required skilled application and had received it. She documented everything, photographed everything, marked the chandelier and 2 of the built-in cabinet sections as candidates for removal to the county museum, knowing there was not time or personnel today, and that the recommendation would go into her report, and the report would go into a file, and the file would record what had been here before the water came. That was the work, recording what had been here, bearing witness on paper to the existence of things that would no longer exist by evening. She went upstairs at 11:15 and worked through the 4 bedrooms and the upstairs hallway in 90 minutes. Less to document up there, the rooms had been emptied more thoroughly, the personal history of the family reduced to the shapes left in wallpaper, and the marks on door frames where generations of children had been measured against the wood. She came back down at 12:40 and went to the basement. The main basement ran the full footprint of the house. Stone walls, a poured concrete floor, added sometime in the 1940s over the original dirt. The infrastructure of a house that had been maintained and updated across a century. A coal furnace converted to oil, an oil system partially updated to gas plumbing that showed 3 distinct eras of work in the same wall. Empty metal shelving along 2 walls, the kind used for storage, still holding the ghost shapes of what had stood on them and the slight variations in dust across the shelves. She worked her way along the perimeter, documenting, photographing, checking items against the floor plan. At the far end of the basement, behind the last section of metal shelving which had been pulled slightly away from the wall, she noted recently enough that the marks on the concrete floor were not yet dusty, was a door. She almost missed it. The shelving had been positioned to obscure it, not completely, but sufficiently that a person moving through the basement without looking for it would not register its presence. She saw it because she was working the perimeter, and the perimeter included the wall behind the shelving, and she moved the shelving aside, and the door was there. Oak-heavy, set into a stone arch that was original 1921 construction. The door itself the same. Iron hinges substantial, the kind built into the wall rather than simply screwed to its surface. And on the door, through a steel hasp bolted to the wood with 4 screws, whose metal was clean and bright against the aged oak around them, a padlock. She looked at it for a moment. Then she unfolded the 1921 architectural drawings and found the basement level plan. Storage room B, sub-basement level, accessed from main basement via stair. The room was drawn clearly a separate space below the primary basement floor, reached by a short stair with its own footprint of approximately 12 by 16 feet. She found Calvin's 2016 inventory documentation in her folder. She went through it twice. Storage room B was not listed as empty, not listed as inaccessible or excluded for any stated reason, simply absent from the document entirely, as if the room did not exist. But she was standing in front of the door to it, and the 1921 drawings showed it clearly, and the door was here, and the door was locked with a lock that had not been here in 1921, or 1941, or 1981, or any year until someone had come down to this basement with a steel hasp and a drill and a padlock, and had attached them to a 100-year-old door with the specific intention of keeping it closed. The screws were clean. Not recently installed, there was some oxidation, some dust in the heads, but recent compared to the door, recent compared to the hinges, recent compared to everything else in this basement. She estimated 10 years, perhaps 15. Calvin had signed the transfer agreement in 2016. She went back up the stairs and through the main floor and out the front door to where Stuart Halley was sitting in the van with the window down and a cup of coffee going cold on the dashboard. She showed him the architectural drawings with the sub-basement room marked. She showed him the inventory documentation with the room absent. She told him about the lock. Stuart looked at the drawings. He looked at the inventory. He looked at his watch. He said, "We don't have a key." Nora said no, but we have the locksmith in the truck out there. The flood authority had sent a contractor with the access team for exactly the situations where sealed spaces needed to be documented before the water came. It was standard procedure for reservoir projects involving occupied or previously occupied structures. Stuart looked at her. Then he looked at the drawings again. Then he said 15 minutes. If you believe that old houses always hold back something, they were not ready to give up stay with us for the next 6 hours. Because what was behind that door had been waiting for exactly this kind of deadline to make it impossible to look away. Nora had 14 minutes while she waited for the locksmith. She went back upstairs rather than stand in the basement watching a man work. Standing and watching was not how she used time. She had 4 hours and 40-something minutes left in a house that was going underwater at 3 o'clock, and she was going to use every minute of it. She went to the study on the main floor. She had moved through it quickly. On her first pass had photographed the wallpaper, noted the built-in shelving marked the dimensions in her documentation. The room had been emptied of its furnishings with one exception, a desk. Oak heavy, the kind of desk built in the early 20th century to last several lifetimes, and which had. It was positioned under the window facing the door, and it was the only piece of furniture remaining in the room. Everything else Calvin had removed or left to be removed. The desk he had left. She had noted it on her first pass without examining it carefully. She examined it now. The surface was clear. The leather inset was cracked with age. The gold tooling at the border faded to a ghost of itself. 3 drawers on the right side, 3 on the left. She opened them in order. The first 5 were empty. The 6th, the bottom drawer on the left, the deep drawer that in desks of this era was typically used for hanging files or oversized documents, was not entirely empty. In the back left corner, partially obscured by the shadow of the drawer itself, an envelope. She lifted it out. Standard letter envelope, white, the kind available at any drugstore. Not sealed. The flap was tucked in rather than glued. No stamp. No address on the front. No name. She opened it. Inside was a single sheet of paper folded once. The handwriting was small and deliberate, the kind of hand that had learned to write with economy and had kept the habit. She unfolded it and read it. It was short. This house was built with money that was not ours. I cannot give the money back. I can give the house back. CV. Below the initials a date, April 2016. 3 months before Calvin Voss had signed the voluntary transfer agreement. Nora stood in the empty study with the sheet of paper in her hand and read it twice more. Not because it was difficult to understand, because she wanted to be certain she was understanding it correctly the first time before she allowed herself to consider what it meant. This house was built with money that was not ours. Not money that was lost. Not money that went wrong in a business that failed. Money that was not ours. The distinction was precise, and Calvin had made it precisely in the way of a man who had been thinking about the wording for a long time. She put the sheet back in the envelope and the envelope in a clear archival bag from her kit, labeled it with the room and the date and her initials, and set it in her document case. Then she pulled out the folder of background records she had assembled before the visit. Standard practice for a site documentation of historical significance, she had requested the county's available records on the property and the family before coming. She had not read them thoroughly. She had skimmed them for structural and ownership information and had not gone deeper, because her job today was documentation, not history. She went deeper now. Nathaniel Voss, born 1888, died 1967, Harlan County native. Began his working life in the timber industry in his early 20s and had established himself as an independent operator by the time he was 30. In 1919, he had entered into a formal business partnership recorded with the county. She found the partnership filing. Voss Timber Company. Established August 1919. Partners Nathaniel Henry Voss and Arthur James Finch. Equal shares. Combined initial capitalization $14,000. She read the next entry in the record. Voss Timber Company. Dissolved February 1922. Reason recorded irrecoverable capital loss resulting from market contraction in regional timber sector, 1921 to 1922. She sat with that for a moment. Irrecoverable capital loss. The language of a business that had failed, that had consumed its initial investment, and had nothing left to distribute to its partners. Standard dissolution language. The kind of entry that appeared in county business records dozens of times in the years following the economic contractions of the early 1920s. Nothing unusual about it on its face. Nathaniel Voss had built Voss Mansion in 1921, the same year the timber market contracted, the same year the business he shared with Arthur Finch was failing or was recorded as failing or was being characterized as failing. She checked the next record she had pulled. Arthur Finch. She had included him because his name appeared in the partnership filing, and she had learned over 34 years to pull every name that appeared in documents related to a property she was documenting. Arthur James Finch, born 1893, died 1951. Harlan County. No property in his name at time of death. Estate recorded as household goods, estimated value $40. Survived by wife Margaret and daughter Bess. She looked at the date of death. 1951, 58 years old. She looked at the estate value, $40. A man who had invested $7,000, his equal half of the $14,000 initial capitalization, in a timber partnership in 1919, had died 32 years later with household goods worth $40. Nathaniel Voss had built a mansion in 1921. Arthur Finch had died in 1951 with $40 worth of household goods. And Calvin Voss, 77 years old, had written 2 sentences on a piece of paper in April of 2016 and signed his initials and put the paper in the bottom drawer of the desk his grandfather had used in the house his grandfather had built, and then had driven to the county offices and signed the voluntary transfer agreement without explanation. This house was built with money that was not ours. She heard the locksmith's voice from the basement stairwell, clear and brief, carrying up through the empty house the way voices carry in structures with nothing left to absorb sound. "Done," he said. "It's open?" Nora put the folder back in her case, picked up her clipboard and her camera and her document kit, and walked to the basement stairs. Storage room B was waiting. The locksmith was already back upstairs when Nora reached the bottom of the basement stairs. She had not asked him to wait. He had done his work and left, which was what she wanted, a clean entry. No one standing in the doorway asking questions or offering observations. She had the camera and the clipboard and the document kit, and she wanted to be alone with whatever was in the room before she made any decisions about it. The door stood open. She put her flashlight through the doorway first, the way she had learned to enter unfamiliar spaces after 3 decades of going into rooms that had not been opened in a long time. She swept the beam around the perimeter before she stepped in. She was checking for structural hazards, water infiltration, floor, weakness, ceiling, instability, but she was also doing what she always did in a new space, which was look at the whole of it before she approached any part. The room was 10 feet by 10 feet with a ceiling low enough that she was aware of it without being uncomfortable. The walls were brick solid, the same construction as the mansion's foundation, built to last and having lasted. There was no window, had never been a window according to the 1921 drawings. The room had been designed as a coal storage chamber for the house's original heating system, a sealed interior space where temperature stability was a feature rather than a limitation. Whatever was stored in here was stored in the best natural preservation conditions the building could offer. The air was dry. She had expected the slight mineral heaviness of an old basement room, the particular quality of air that has been cycled slowly through stone over many years. What she got was something closer to the air in the county records vault, where she had worked for 34 years, stable, dry, the air of a room that had been built to hold things without letting time damage them. The floor was the original poured concrete of the sub-basement level, unmarked and solid under her feet. The walls were clean, no water staining, no efflorescence, no evidence that moisture had found a way in through the brick. In the center of the room, a table. Small, plain pine construction, the kind of work table that belonged in a basement. The surface was unfinished wood, and on the surface positioned slightly left of center with the deliberateness of an object that had been placed rather than set down a box. It was a document box, steel black, approximately the dimensions of a large ledger. The corners were reinforced with heavier steel, the kind of construction used for fireproof document storage in the early 20th century. The lid had a hasp for a separate lock. The lock was open, the shackle hanging unlatched. On the lid, pressed into the metal in the raised letters of a die-cut stamp, N.E. Voss, private. Not Voss family, not the house name or the business name. His name, his middle initial. The box of a man who had distinguished between what belonged to the household and what belonged to him specifically, and who had marked that distinction in permanent metal. She stood at the table and looked at the box for a moment before she looked at anything else. Then she looked at the chair, a wooden stool, the kind used for workshop seating, positioned beside the table in the way of something that had been used and left in its last position. Not stored, used. Someone had sat on this stool at this table in this room. Then she looked at the table leg, tied to the near leg of the table with a piece of cloth cord knotted with the careful double wrap of someone who wanted the knot to stay but to be undoable, a key. Small, the kind of key made for a document box lock rather than a door. The cloth cord was the same dark blue as the tape she had seen on the tin box in Vera Stanton's room. Not that she knew that story, not that she had any reason to make the connection. She simply observed that the cord was deliberately chosen and deliberately applied, and that someone had made a decision about where to leave this key that was not the same decision as leaving it on the table or in a drawer or in a pocket. The key was inside the room. The door had been padlocked from outside. Nora stood in the 10 by 10 room and worked through the logic of that arrangement with the patience of someone who had spent 34 years understanding why documents were filed the way they were filed. Calvin had locked the door from the outside. He had locked it with a padlock he had purchased and installed himself at some point in the years before he signed the transfer. He had then left the key to the document box inside the room tied to the table leg, where it would be found immediately by anyone who entered, where it could not be missed, where it required no searching. He had made the room inaccessible to anyone without a reason to open it. He had made the contents of the box immediately accessible to anyone who had a reason to enter. This was not the arrangement of someone hiding something. This was the arrangement of someone controlling the conditions under which something would be found. Calvin had not wanted the box opened casually by someone walking through a basement who happened to notice a document box on a table and lifted the lid out of ordinary curiosity. He had wanted the box opened by someone who had gone through the process of finding the locked door, noting its absence from the official inventory, determining that it existed on the architectural drawings, and making the affirmative decision to open it. Someone who had, in other words, already done enough work to deserve what was inside. He had trusted time to send the right person. Nora looked at her watch. 10:47, 4 hours and 13 minutes before the valve closed. She untied the key from the table leg, set it on the table surface, and opened the document box. The interior was lined with the same dark cloth used in document cases of the early 20th century, a heavy cotton felt that kept objects from shifting and absorbed minor moisture variations. The lining was intact. The contents had not shifted. 3 items arranged from left to right with the same care she had observed in the placement of the key and the positioning of the box. On the left, a ledger, slim-bound in dark cloth, the kind of accounting ledger used by small businesses in the early 20th century. The spine was intact. The cover showed the wear of regular handling, not recent handling, the kind of wear that happens over years of being picked up and set down. In the center, a photograph. Black and white mounted on cardstock, the formal portrait style of the early 1920s. 2 men standing in front of a structure that was partially built. She could see the framing of a house behind them, the skeleton of walls not yet enclosed. Both men were looking at the camera. Both were dressed in work clothes rather than formal attire, the clothing of men who had been working and had stopped to have a photograph taken. And on the right, beneath the other 2 items, slightly larger than both, an envelope. Thick, the kind of thickness that comes from multiple folded pages inside. The seal was wax dark red, cracked along the fold line, but still holding the flap closed. The wax had been applied over the sealed flap, pressed flat, and had dried in a slight dome that had settled with age. On the front of the envelope, in ink that had faded to a warm brown, but remained entirely legible for James. To be opened only when I am gone. Father. Nora looked at the envelope for a long time. She had the family records in her folder upstairs. She did not need to check them to know that James Voss was Nathaniel's son. She did know from the records she had reviewed that morning that James Voss had died in 1982, 15 years after Nathaniel, who had died in 1967. Nathaniel had written a letter to his son, sealed it with wax, and placed it in the document box in storage room B. He had written on the envelope that it was to be opened only when he was gone. Nathaniel had died in 1967. James had never opened the letter. Nora set the ledger on the table first. She worked from left to right the way she had worked through files for 34 years, in the order things had been placed, which was usually the order that made sense of them. Someone had arranged these 3 items with intention. She would encounter them in the sequence they had been left. The ledger was slim-bound in dark cloth, the cover worn with the particular softness that comes from being handled regularly over years and then not handled at all for a much longer span. She opened it to the first page. Voss Finch Timber Company. Established August 1919. General Ledger of Accounts. She turned pages carefully, the paper dry and intact. The columns of figures entered in 2 different hands. The meticulous record of a business that had been maintained with care. Revenue entries, expense entries, equipment purchases, payroll. The ordinary accounting of a small timber operation in rural Kentucky in the years after the First World War, when the construction industry was rebuilding and timber was moving. She turned to November 1921. The entry at the top of the page recorded the total capitalization of the business at that date. She read the figures slowly. Total partnership capital $28,400, Voss share $14,200, Finch share $14,200, equal, precise. The record of 2 men who had built something together from equal investment and equal commitment and had kept the books to prove it. She turned to the next page. January 1922. 1 entry centered on the page, written in a single hand, Nathaniel's hand. She would later confirm against the letter. The entry was brief. It occupied 2 lines. Shipping loss, $14,200. Finch share absorbed. She read it twice. Finch share absorbed. Not lost, not destroyed, absorbed. A word that meant taken and incorporated, made part of something larger. The accountant's language of a man who could not bring himself to write what had actually happened, but could not entirely hide it either. Not from himself, not in the private ledger that no one else would ever see. She set the ledger down and picked up the photograph. 2 men young, somewhere in their early 30s. Standing in front of the skeletal framing of a house, She could see the exposed joists and the upright studs and the beginning of the roofline, the structure of a large house in the earliest phase of its construction. Both men were in work clothes, the clothing of the job site rather than the office. Both were looking at the camera with the particular ease of men who are comfortable in each other's presence, who have been photographed together before, and do not feel required to arrange themselves formally. One man had his hand on the other's shoulder. On the back, in faded pencil, a date and two names. 1920. Anna Chettenfar. And Arthur F. They were smiling. Nora set the photograph beside the ledger and looked at both of them together. The photograph from 1920, when the partnership was 1 year old, and the men in it were friends who put their hands on each other's shoulders in front of a house being built. The ledger entry from January 1922, when one of those men wrote 2 lines that erased the other's $14,000 from the record and called it absorbed. She picked up the envelope. The wax seal was cracked along the fold but holding. She worked the flap open, carefully preserving the seal, as she had been trained to preserve the integrity of documents even when opening them was the point. Inside 11 pages of paper, folded together, covered on both sides, in a handwriting that was deliberate in the way of a man whose hands were no longer entirely steady, but whose intention was entirely clear. She began to read. Nathaniel had written the letter in March of 1962. He was 74 years old, and he addressed his son James directly, without preamble, without the formal openings of official correspondence. He wrote the way a man writes when he has rehearsed the words for a long time and has finally decided that rehearsal has served its purpose and it is time to simply say the thing. There had been no shipping loss in January 1922. He had transferred Arthur Finch's $14,200 into a separate account in his own name over the course of 3 weeks in December 1921 and January 1922. He had done it incrementally in amounts small enough not to draw attention through the same banking relationships he used for the legitimate business. He had then recorded the loss in the ledger and dissolved the partnership and told Arthur that the capital was gone. Arthur had believed him. He had believed him, Nathaniel wrote, because they had been friends since they were 13 years old. Because Arthur had trusted Nathaniel to keep the books, had never asked to see them independently, had assumed that the man he had known for 20 years would not take from him what he could not afford to lose. Arthur had no independent documentation of the partnership capitalization because he had trusted Nathaniel to hold the records. The house had been built with Arthur's money, not with business profits, not with Nathaniel's personal savings. The $14,000 that Arthur Finch had invested in their shared company had been used to build Voss Mansion in 1921, before the dissolution was recorded, before the loss was entered in the ledger. The construction cost of the house was $14,000. The timing was exact. Nora read that section of the letter twice. She thought about the house around her, the brick walls, the walnut cabinetry, the chandelier in the front hall, the wallpaper in the study where she had found Calvin's note in the bottom drawer of the desk. Everything she had spent the morning documenting, everything she had marked for the county museum, everything that was going underwater at 3 o'clock this afternoon. All of it built from Arthur Finch's money. She continued reading. Nathaniel had told himself he would repay the debt. He had not repaid it. When Arthur Finch died in 1951, 58 years old, with household goods worth $40 and a wife and a daughter, Nathaniel had told himself the matter was closed. The man he had wronged was dead. The debt had nowhere to go. But the matter was not closed. He had continued living in the house. He had continued sitting at the desk, built from Arthur's money, and sleeping in the rooms built from Arthur's money, and looking out the windows framed with Arthur's money, at the land that Arthur's money had made possible to own. And in March of 1962, at 74 years old, he had picked up a pen and written 11 pages. Arthur's widow had died in 1963. He wrote 1 year after the letter. He had seen the notice. There was a child, he wrote. He had not looked up the name. Nora stopped at that line. She read it again. I did not look up the name because knowing the name would mean having to do something. I have lived my entire adult life not knowing that name as a way of not having to act on knowing it. She sat with that sentence in the dry, still air of the sub-basement room. Nathaniel had built his protection from action into the architecture of his ignorance. As long as he did not know the name of Arthur's child, he could not be expected to contact that person. As long as he could not contact them, he could defer the question of what to do. The not knowing was not accidental. It was a structure he had built and maintained for 40 years as deliberately as the house above her head. She read the final paragraph. I do not have the courage to send this letter. I do not have the courage to destroy it. I am placing it here and hoping that my son has the courage I do not have. If he does not, if you are reading this and you are not James, if somehow this has gone further than I intended, then you will understand more than I did at your age about the things we build and what they cost the people who did not get to live in them. She turned to the last page to find the signature. Nathaniel Edmund Voss, March 14, 1962. And below the signature, in different ink and different handwriting, a younger hand, a steadier hand, the hand of someone writing in a different decade entirely. I have read this letter. I understand why my grandfather could not send it and why my father could not open it. The house will answer for both of them. CV June 2015. Nora looked at the date. June 2015. The caretaker Merle Doss had told the Historical Preservation Society in the initial conversations about the property that Calvin had come down to the basement alone in 2015, had stayed for 2 hours, had come back up without anything in his hands and had not spoken for the rest of the day. He had come down here and read the letter and sat in this room for 2 hours with what he had found, and then he had picked up the pen and added one line and locked the door and gone back upstairs. 1 year later, he had signed the voluntary transfer. He had not sold the house. He had not demolished it. He had not contacted anyone or hired a lawyer or attempted any form of private restitution. He had given the house back to the state, to the flood project, to the water that would cover it. He had found the one action available to him that was neither keeping the house nor making a private transaction of it. He had returned it to something larger than the family that had built it wrong. And he had locked this door and left the key inside and trusted that the flood project would send someone with a reason to open it. If you are reading this and you are not James, she was not James. She was 66 years old and she was a retired county archivist, and she had 6 hours of which 2 hours and 8 minutes remained, and she was sitting in a 10 by 10 room 60 feet above, where the water line would be, by evening. And she understood more than Nathaniel Voss had at her age about the things we build and what they cost the people who did not get to live in them. Nora came up from the sub-basement and sat on the 3rd step of the basement stairs where the phone signal was stronger. She had 2 hours and 26 minutes before the valve closed. She had the ledger, the photograph, and the 11-page letter in her document case. She had Calvin's note from the study desk in its archival bag. She had the name Nathaniel had spent 40 years not looking up. She looked it up now. The Harlan County Gazette had been digitized through 1975 by the State Historical Archive. She knew the database because she had used it for 34 years. She found the obituary in 4 minutes. Arthur James Finch, age 58, died September 14, 1951, preceded in death by his parents, survived by his wife Edna Finch and his daughter Bess Finch. No other survivors listed, no mention of business associations, no mention of Voss Timber Company. The obituary was 7 lines long, the length of an obituary for a man who had lived quietly and died without property, and was mourned by 2 people and remembered by a community that did not know what had been taken from him. Bess Finch. Nathaniel had written, I did not look up the name, because knowing the name would mean having to do something. The name was Bess. Nora searched further. Bess Finch, Harlan County, Kentucky. The name appeared in several local records over the following decades, a teaching certificate issued by the state in 1961, a listing in a Knox County School District directory from 1978, a brief mention in a Corbin Community newsletter from 2019 recognizing retired educators. Bess Finch Hartley, retired elementary school teacher, Corbin, Kentucky. Nora found a listed phone number in the public directory. She looked at it for a moment. She was a county archivist. Her job was documentation. She had spent 34 years in the discipline of finding information and recording it accurately and placing it in the correct file where it could be accessed by the people who needed it. She had not spent those years deciding who deserved to know what was in the files. The files belonged to the record, and the record belonged to everyone. She dialed the number. It rang 3 times. Then a woman's voice, clear and slightly cautious in the way of someone who does not recognize the number but answers anyway. Nora said her name. She said she was a retired county archivist working on behalf of the Harlan County Historical Preservation Society. She said she was calling from inside Voss Mansion, which was scheduled to be submerged in a reservoir project that afternoon. She said she had found documents in the mansion that related to a man named Arthur Finch. A brief silence. Then Arthur Finch was my father. Nora said, yes, I know. I found his name in the county records. I wanted to ask if you knew a man named Nathaniel Voss. The answer came without hesitation. The man with the big house at the end of the road. My father worked with him before I was born, before everything. She paused. He didn't come to the funeral. I remember my mother saying that. After my father died, when people came to the house, she said it once that man didn't come to the funeral. She didn't say it with anger. She said it the way you say something you've been turning over for a long time and have finally decided to put down. Nora looked at the letter in her document case. Nathaniel, at 74 years old, writing 11 pages in a hand that was no longer steady, confessing to a son who would never read it that he had not gone to Arthur's funeral because he could not stand beside the coffin of the man whose money had built his house. She said, I think I found the reason he didn't come. The silence on the other end was brief and careful, the silence of a woman who had lived 84 years and had learned to measure what she said next. Then Bess Hartley said, what did you find? Nora said, I found a ledger from the business your father and Nathaniel Voss ran together. And I found a letter that Nathaniel wrote to his son in 1962 that his son never opened. She paused. I think you should read both of them, she said. Not over the phone, in person with time to sit with them. Bess said, how far is Corbin from where you are? Nora said 80 miles approximately. Bess said, I see. A moment. Then I need to know one thing first. Before I agree to anything or drive anywhere or read any letter from any man I never trusted, my father, did he know? Did he know what was happening to his money? Nora looked at the letter. She could see the line from where she sat, the line she had read twice and then sat with for a long time in the sub-basement room. Arthur trusted me. He had no independent documentation because he trusted me to keep the records. She said no. He didn't know. He trusted Nathaniel completely, and Nathaniel used that trust. Your father never knew. The silence this time was longer. She could hear the particular quality of it, not empty, not stunned. Full. The silence of a woman receiving something she had half suspected for 84 years without ever having the shape of it confirmed, and finding that the confirmation felt different than the suspicion had felt, more settled, somehow more final and more necessary. Then Bess Hartley said, all right, I'll come. Nora came up from the basement at 1:43 in the afternoon. She had 17 minutes before the valve closed. She carried the document case with both hands, the trap inside it, the ledger, the photograph, the 11 pages of Nathaniel's letter and Calvin's 2-sentence note in its separate archival bag. Each item labeled, each item sealed in the clear protective sleeve she had brought for exactly this kind of material. She had done this work for 34 years, and she had never left a document behind because she ran out of time. Stuart was outside with the van engine running. He looked at her when she came through the front door, and then looked at the document case and did not ask what was in it. He had learned over 20 years of working with county archivists that the asking came after the leaving. They drove to the access road above the valley at 2:55. At 3 o'clock, the flood authority engineer radioed the control station, and the valve began to close. The water did not rush in the way of a flood. It rose the way reservoir water rises slowly with the particular inevitability of something that has been planned and permitted and engineered and is now simply following the physics it was designed to follow. Nora stood beside the van and watched. The lower fields disappeared first, then the fence lines, then the foundation plantings around the base of the mansion, the shrubs that had been there since the 1940s going under without drama. The water came up the brick walls evenly, without preference, covering everything at the same rate. The front door went under at 3:41, the upper windows at 4:15, the roof line at 4:52. Voss Mansion ceased to be visible at 4:52 in the afternoon of the day Nora Galt had been given 6 hours to document it. She stood there until the water was still. Then Stewart said that Bess Hartley had called the society's number while they were waiting and had confirmed she was on her way from Corbin. 80 miles, approximately 2 hours of driving, which put her arrival at around 5:30. Nora had 40 minutes. She walked down the access road toward a small cabin she had seen on the property maps, a caretaker structure set on higher ground half a mile north of the mansion's former position outside the flood zone, with a clear view down the slope to where the water now sat still and opaque. Merle Doss was already outside. He was a tall man, 71 years old, the kind of lean that comes from decades of physical work, and not from any particular attention to it. He was standing at the edge of his property, looking down at the water, with the expression of a man who had known this was coming for 3 years and had not entirely believed it until now. He heard her on the path and turned. She introduced herself, told him she had been inside the mansion that morning. He nodded. Stewart had told him a preservation archivist would be coming. She asked him about Calvin. He looked back at the water for a moment before he answered. Calvin came to the house one time in the last years, Merle said. Just the once after years of not coming. No warning, no phone call. I heard the car on the drive and went to the door, and it was him. He said he needed to go to the basement, said he needed to go alone. Merle had waited upstairs. He had made coffee and sat at the kitchen table and waited while Calvin was in the basement for what he estimated at close to 2 hours, checking the clock twice in the second hour, because the length of it had begun to seem unusual. Calvin came up with nothing in his hands, Merle said. He had gone down carrying nothing, and he came up carrying nothing. He sat at the table and drank a cup of coffee and did not speak for perhaps 20 minutes. Not uncomfortable silence, just the silence of a man who is somewhere else in his head and is not ready to come back yet. Then he had left. A year later, he had signed the voluntary transfer. Merle said I asked him once, after he signed it, why he didn't fight the condemnation. The society had offered him legal support. He had grounds, the property had historical designation, there were arguments to be made. He didn't want any of them made. He was quiet for a moment. He said to me, Merle, this isn't our house to keep. He said it quietly, Merle continued. Not angry, not resigned, just as a fact. The way you state something you have spent time arriving at and have finally arrived at completely. Nora thought about the 2 sentences in the bottom drawer of the oak desk. The house was built with money that was not ours. I cannot give the money back. I can give the house back. Calvin had said the same thing to Merle that he had written on the paper in different words, with the same meaning. He had said it once out loud to the one person who had lived beside the house for 28 years, and then he had not explained further. She told Merle what she had found in storage room B. She told him about the trap and the ledger and the photograph and the letter. She told him about Arthur Finch and the $14,000 and the one line in the January 1922 accounts. She told him about Nathaniel writing 11 pages in 1962 and sealing them for a son who would never open them. She told him about Calvin's line at the bottom of the last page and the date beside it. Merle listened without interrupting. He was a man who had spent 28 years with a house that did not belong to him and had learned the patience of someone who understands that their job is to maintain what is there, not to own it. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment. Then he said he left it down there for someone to find. It was not a question. Nora said yes. Merle looked back at the water. The surface was still now, the valley below them transformed into something flat and permanent and without memory of what had been there before. He said Calvin knew. He went down there and he read whatever was in that box, and he knew. And he came upstairs and sat at my table and didn't say a word of it. He was quiet again. Then he said, did he leave anything else in the house? Anything else he wanted someone to find? Nora said he left a note in the desk in the study. 2 sentences. Merle looked at her. He wanted someone to find it, he said. Not a question this time either, just the statement of a man placing pieces together in the order that made sense of them. Nora said yes. He locked the room and left the key inside and listed the room as absent from the inventory. He wanted the right person to find it. Merle nodded slowly and turned back to the water. I wondered for 28 years, he said, why that house felt like it was holding something back. Most old houses feel empty when the people leave them. That one never did. It always felt like it was waiting. He looked at the still water where the roofline had been an hour ago. Good, he said. I'm glad someone went in. If you have ever stood beside something for years and felt that it was holding something it needed to give up, tell us in the comments. Because Merle Doss kept that house for 28 years and felt it the whole time and never knew what it was until today. Bess Hartley arrived at 5:27. Nora heard the car on the access road before she saw it, a practical sedan moving carefully on the gravel, the driving of someone who has been behind the wheel for a long time and has learned to treat roads with appropriate respect. Bess parked beside Merle's truck and got out without hurrying. She was 84 years old and she was straight-backed, and she shook Nora's hand with the firm, brief grip of a woman who had spent decades teaching children and had never lost the habit of meeting people directly. She looked at the valley below the cabin, at the flat surface of the new reservoir, catching the last of the evening light, and she looked at it for a moment without speaking. Then she said, so that's where it is now. Not a question, just the statement of a woman orienting herself to a landscape that was different from what it had been this morning and would never be otherwise again. They went inside. Merle had set coffee on the table and 3 chairs and had made himself absent with the tact of a man who understood that what was about to happen at his table was not his to witness unless he was invited. He was in the back room. The front room was theirs. Nora laid the contents of the document case on the table in order. The photograph first faced down the way she always presented documents, letting the person decide the pace of turning them over. The ledger beside it. The 11 pages of Nathaniel's letter in sequence, Calvin's note in its archival bag. She said, I want to show you these in order if that's all right. You can take as long as you need with each one. Bess said, show me. Nora turned over the photograph. 2 men in work clothes standing in front of the skeletal framing of a house not yet built. 1920, the pencil notation on the back. N. Voss and Arthur F. Bess looked at it. She did not speak immediately. She reached out and touched the edge of the photograph with 2 fingers, not picking it up, just touching it the way you touch something you want to confirm is real. She said, that's my father, the one on the left. She said it quietly and without elaboration, the way you identify someone you have not seen in a very long time and whose face you still know without having to search for it. Arthur Finch was 27 years old in the photograph. He was looking at the camera with the ease of a man who did not yet know what the next 2 years would cost him. His hand was at his side. The other man's hand was on his shoulder. Bess looked at the photograph for a moment longer and then sat back and nodded at Nora to continue. Nora opened the ledger to the November 1921 page and set it in front of her. Bess read slowly. She was 84 years old, and she read the way people read when they have learned that reading too quickly is how you miss what matters. She found the column of figures, the equal division 14,200 on each side. She found the January 1922 entry. She read the 2 lines. Shipping loss, $14,200. Finch share absorbed. She read it twice. Then she looked up at Nora and said absorbed. Nora said yes. Bess looked back at the ledger. She did not say anything for a moment. She was doing the arithmetic that Nora had done that morning in the sub-basement room, not the arithmetic of the figures which were simple, but the arithmetic of what those figures meant laid against a life. Nora placed the letter in front of her. Bess read all 11 pages. She read without pausing, without looking up, without any of the small signals people give when they are reading something difficult and need to surface for a moment. She read the way she had probably read things her entire life, completely from beginning to end, giving the document the attention it had taken Nathaniel a lifetime to deserve. She read Calvin's line at the bottom of the last page. She read the date beside it, June 2015. She set the letter down on the table and looked out the window at the dark water below. The reservoir was still. No current, no movement, just the flat surface of a lake that had not existed this morning and would be here for 100 years. Bess said my mother gave private lessons after my father died, reading and arithmetic to children in the neighborhood whose parents could afford 20 cents an hour. She did that for 11 years until I finished school and started working. She looked at the table. We didn't have a car, she said. She walked to every house. In the winter, she wore the same coat for 8 years because there wasn't money for another one. I knew we were poor, the way children know things not from being told, but from what was absent. The things other families had that we didn't have and that nobody talked about directly. She stopped. I didn't know it could have been different, she said. I understood that we were poor because my father died young and left nothing. That was the explanation, and it was sufficient because I didn't have another one. She looked at Nora. Now I have another one, she said. Now I know it could have been different, because someone made a decision that it wouldn't be. And there's nothing to do with that, except know it. My father has been dead for 72 years. My mother has been dead for 60. Nathaniel Voss has been dead for 56 years. The house is at the bottom of that lake. She said it without anger, not because she did not have the right to anger, she had every right to it, but because she was 84 years old and had spent a long time with the shape of what her life had been, and adding the explanation for that shape did not change the shape itself. It only told her where it had come from. There was a difference between those two things. She seemed to understand that difference clearly. After a moment, she said the man who signed the house away. Calvin. Did he know about me specifically? Nora said he knew there was a child. His grandfather wrote that he had not looked up the name. Bess said, but he signed the papers anyway, without knowing my name. Nora said yes. Bess looked at the letter on the table. At Nathaniel's handwriting on 11 pages and Calvin's one line at the bottom, added 43 years later in a different ink, she said he couldn't give the money back. He couldn't find me and give me money that would have been his money, not my father's. It wouldn't have been the same thing. But he could give the house back to something that wasn't his family. So that's what he did. She said it the way you say something you have just understood and are speaking aloud to confirm the understanding. Then she looked at Nora and said, "Is there a way to put this on record?" Officially, I don't want money. There's no money to want, and I'm 84 years old and I have what I need. I don't want the land, it's under 60 feet of water, but I want there to be a record that says Arthur James Finch was a co-owner of that property from the beginning, that his name belongs in the history of that house, even though his name was never on the deed, that the house existed because of him. She folded her hands on the table. Whatever it takes to do that, she said, I want it done. Nora drove back to Stuart Halley's vehicle at the access road just before 6 o'clock. She had left Bess at Merle's table with the documents still spread in front of her. Bess had asked for 10 minutes alone with them before the official transfer process began. Nora had given her the 10 minutes without question. Some things required a moment without anyone watching. Stuart was making notes in his intake log when she knocked on the window of the van. He rolled it down and she told him what she had found and what it meant and what Bess Hartley had requested. He listened to all of it without interrupting. Stuart Halley had been with the Historical Preservation Society for 22 years, and he had the professional patience of someone who had heard many things in old houses and had learned that the appropriate first response to most of them was to listen completely before speaking. When she finished, he said the trap and all its contents go into the Voss Mansion historical file, full provenance documentation. I'll process the accession tonight. Nora said Bess wants Arthur Finch's name in the record. Stuart said, I heard you. Voss Finch Timber Company, co-founder, 1919, source of construction capital for the mansion. It goes in the main entry. He said it simply the way you say things that are obvious once someone has explained them to you. The historical record of Voss Mansion would include what had actually been true about the mansion from the beginning. That was what historical records were for. They went back inside together. The formal accession process took 40 minutes. Bess signed the request for the record amendment in the handwriting of a woman who had been signing official documents for 60 years and had never learned to be tentative about it. Stewart countersigned as the society's representative. The amendment would be entered into the county historical database within the week Voss Mansion, 1921 to 2023, Harlan County, Kentucky. Construction financed through the capital of the Voss Finch Timber Company, 1919, co-founded by Nathaniel Edmund Voss and Arthur James Finch in equal partnership. 2 names in the same record for the first time in 103 years. The photograph would be enlarged and framed and hung in the Society's office. Nora had suggested it, and Stewart had agreed immediately. The caption would read Nathaniel E. Voss and Arthur J. Finch, 1920. 2 men standing in front of the frame of a house that was not yet built. 2 men with their hands on each other's shoulders looking at the camera with the ease of people who trusted each other and did not yet know what that trust would cost one of them. The caption would not explain what happened after 1920. The photograph would carry the 2 names and leave the rest to the record, which was where the rest belonged. Bess shook Nora's hand again before she left, the same firm grip as when she arrived. She said my father worked hard for what he built. It's right that his name is there. Then she got in her car and drove the 80 miles back to Corbin. Nora drove home the long way around the perimeter of the new reservoir. It added 20 minutes to the trip, and she took them. The water was dark and flat in the headlights when she passed the observation point above the valley. No current, no surface disturbance. The reservoir had reached its initial fill level and was settling into the stillness of a permanent thing. Below the surface, 60 feet down, where the light from her headlights could not reach the foundation of Voss Mansion, was sitting on the valley floor, where it had been sitting since 1921. The brick walls were down there, the walnut cabinetry, the original wallpaper in the study, the oak desk with the empty bottom drawer. The trap was in her document case on the back seat. She thought about Calvin coming down the access road in 2015, in his own car parking, going through the front door and down the stairs to the basement and through the main basement to the door at the end, and unlocking it with a key. He must have found somewhere in the house's history, in a desk drawer, in a box of family papers, in a place where Nathaniel or James had left it without explanation. She thought about him sitting in the room for 2 hours with the ledger and the photograph and the letter, reading all 11 pages, arriving at the last page, and reading his grandfather's final sentence about hoping his son would have the courage he did not have. And Calvin had picked up his pen and written 1 line. He had not contacted the Historical Society. He had not hired a lawyer. He had not looked up the name of Arthur Finch's child because his grandfather had not looked it up, and he had not known where to begin. And the architecture of not knowing was already built into the family, and he had not had enough time or enough certainty to dismantle it entirely. But he had done the thing he could do. He had locked the door from the outside, left the key to the trap inside, omitted the room from the inventory he submitted to the state, and trusted that the flood project would send someone with the credentials to open a locked door and the training to understand what they found inside it. He had not been wrong about that. Nora sat in the parked car above the reservoir for a few minutes before she drove the rest of the way home. She looked at the water. The architectural drawings of Voss Mansion were in the county archive. Her documentation from today was in her case soon to be filed. The amendment to the historical record was in process. The photograph was going on the wall of the Society's office with 2 names beneath it. The house was under 60 feet of water and would be there for 100 years, and none of that had changed, and none of it would change. But the record was above the water. The record said what had been true from the beginning, that Arthur James Finch had stood in front of that house when it was nothing but framing and possibility, and that his investment had made it real, and that his name belonged beside the name of the man who had built on his trust. The record would stay there after the water, after the reservoir, after everyone who had been in that cabin tonight was gone. Nathaniel Voss built that house in 1921 and lived in it for 46 years. He wrote his confession in 1962 and could not send it. He placed it in a steel box in a locked room and hoped his son would have the courage he did not have. His son did not open the letter. His grandson read it 53 years later and told no one, only signed the house away and left one line in ink at the bottom of the last page. And 98 years after the house was built, a woman with 6 hours and a locked door found the reason why. Arthur Finch's name stands now beside Nathaniel Voss's name in the county historical record. The house is underwater, but the record is not. The next story is waiting, another house, another room, another truth that was patient far longer than it should have had to be. It is in the playlist right here.